you hear me? I'm not great. No. How's that? That should be good. Can you hear me all the way in the back? Raise your hand if you can't hear me. Fine. That makes no sense. Hopefully that's the last day to the compliment. Thank you for inviting me here this evening. Those survey results that Reagan cited are depressing, but I had to wonder what would be the result if you asked Americans where Calgary was located. My guess is probably 80% would put it on the supermarket shelf for salad dressings. That'll be as close as you get. I'm going to be speaking on a topic which is a slight revision of the original topic I submitted to the folks who asked me to come here. I've been speaking so many years on going through the history of the topic, beginning with the end of the 19th century and bringing it up to the present. But I couldn't bear the thought of once again rehearsing that history. And so I want to do a focus on a slightly different question this evening, namely a question that recently began to occur to me. I've been involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict, both at a professional level and politically, for about 20 years now. In fact, this month is a kind of anniversary for that involvement. In April 1984, Joan Peters published her book From Time Immemorial. I was at the time a graduate student completing my dissertation, and I picked up the book because the book claimed it was going to completely revolutionize our understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the central thesis of the book was, to put it in a nutshell, that Palestine had been empty on the eve of Zionist colonization. The Zionist settlers made the desert bloom, and after they made the desert bloom, all of these Arabs from neighboring states surreptitiously, secretly entered Palestine and then pretended to be Palestinians. That was the thesis, and were it true, of course, it would revolutionize our understanding of the conflict in the same way as, were the earth flat, it would revolutionize our understanding of astronomy. And I was actually not ready to dismiss that thesis out of hand, because my own personal political history had convinced me, much to my sorrow and disappointment, that many beliefs I held to be sacred and many commitments that I had made in my youth, they turned out to be wrong. Things that I had been dead certain about revealed themselves to be incorrect. And when I picked up the Peters book, I felt I had to open that book, as any book, with an open mind, go through the evidence, and then decide whether or not it's true. In the case of the Peters book, it had an added element which lent, or seemed to lend, credibility to it. The book on the back was blurred by what you might say a who's who of American arts and letters. The Nobel laureate Saul Bellow, the Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel, the prominent historian Barbara Tuchman, the prominent historian Lucy Dawidowich. They all gave the book rave reviews. That who caused me to think and caused me to wonder whether maybe a belief which I was quite certain of, namely there were Palestinians in Palestine, maybe that belief was wrong. Well, as it happened, having carefully read through the book, it turned out that it was a fraud. From start to finish, all the numbers were fake, the footnote references were fraudulently rendered, so on and so forth. And that was my, as it were, baptism into Israel-Palestine. And since then, for the past 20 years, I've been quite consistently involved in the subject, as I said, both professionally and politically. Well, now we're at the 2-decade anniversary, and anniversaries are always moments to reflect on the past, as well as prospects for the future. And the thing that most strikes me, looking back over the period of study and involvement, is that the Israel-Palestine conflict is really not very complicated at all. It doesn't require a knowledge equivalent to rocket science or particle physics. It's actually quite simple, quite straightforward, quite uncomplicated, even in terms of its resolution, unlike what we're often told. And it's also true to say, and now I'm speaking about the present, the recent present, there's pretty much been reached both a consensus on the history of the conflict, an agreement on the history of the conflict, and also an agreement on the basic human rights issues. This wasn't always the case. When I first involved myself in the topic maybe 20 years ago, there was a kind of dominant version of the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And for those of you who go back that far, it basically was what you would call the Leon Uris Exodus version of the Israel-Palestine conflict. That was a very popular book that came out in the early 60s, and it sort of gave the official Israeli version, but rendered in the form of a historical novel. And that's what most people believe. And then there were some dissenters on the margins who said that the history, as we were told it by the Israelis, was not the real history at all. For example, to take one issue which always used to come up, namely, how did the Palestinian refugees become refugees in 1948? What was the impetus that created that situation? Well, the official Israeli position was that in 1948, the Arabs invaded Palestine, and over the radio, they broadcast to the Palestinians that the Palestinians should leave, that once the Arab armies entered, threw the Jews into the sea, then the Palestinians could return. That was the dominant view. There were a few dissenters. In the early 1960s, there were two scholars, one Irish, one Palestinian. The Irishman's name was Erskine Childers, the Palestinian Walid Talibi, and they examined the radio broadcast from 1948, because that was a very heavily monitored area during the 1948 war. The intelligence services of the British, of the Americans, they were all monitoring what's happening there. They monitored the radio broadcasts. Those broadcasts were preserved, the recordings. They went through the recordings, and they found no broadcast telling the Palestinians to leave. They wrote about their findings in the early 60s, as I mentioned a moment ago. It had relatively little impact on the actual presentation of what happened. Beginning in the mid and especially the late 1980s, Israeli scholars began to comb the Israeli archives, and they found that on many of the major points in the Israel-Palestine conflict, the dissenting views, those marginal views, the view that the Palestinians had articulated, if not in scholarship, but the view that they had articulated was the true one. That basically what happened in 1948 was an ethnic cleansing. The Palestinians were expelled from their homeland. It was a premeditated, calculated expulsion of the Palestinians. Nowadays, there are some dissenters still who say no, they still believe the Arab broadcast story, and even among the consensus, there are some nuances. So Benny Morris, who's written most on the question of the refugees, he calls it a partial ethnic cleansing. Others call it a full ethnic cleansing. But these are basically nuances within a framework which is pretty much, as I said, there's pretty much across-the-board agreement. There are many questions in which the dominant view is now the one of the Palestinians and the dissenters held to in years past, and the, so to speak, conventional Israeli narrative has now been displaced. Well, on the question of the history, as I said, there's now basically a consensus. Not on all questions, but on many questions, and most of the crucial ones. On the question of human rights, that's the historical question, the human rights question, we've also reached there a kind of consensus. It happens that in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, you have a multiplicity of human rights organizations which are monitoring what happens there. You have the large organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, which put out quite frequently reports on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And then you have a whole multitude of local affiliates of larger organizations. So, for example, in the case of Israel, you have the Public Committee Against Torture, Israel, Physicians for Human Rights, Israel. You have many, many organizations which are local affiliates of larger organizations which are also monitoring what's happening there. And so you have really a voluminous production of human rights reports on the Israel-Palestine situation. It's almost impossible at this point to keep up with them. I recently, because I'm working on a book on Mr. Dershowitz, I recently printed out, just in the last 3 years or so, maybe 4 years, the human rights reports from the major organizations. It came to at least 3,000 pages, which I read through. And what's remarkable about those human rights reports is there's not even disagreement on minor questions, let alone major questions. You have, even though each of them is fiercely independent, each of these human rights organizations, and even though each of them has its own staff, you'll find on both the criteria that they use for judging issues like, is this torture? Does this constitute torture under international law? And those questions can be fuzzy. They're not so straightforward. And also on what constitutes a war crime, a crime against humanity, and so forth. They not only agree across the board on the criteria, which often can be controversial. But they also agree across the board on their findings. So, for example, most of you will recall the Israeli invasion of the occupied territories in March and April 2002, Operation Defensive Shield, which climaxed in the siege of Jenin. And Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the main Israeli organization, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, all three produced reports on Jenin. And they all reached the same conclusions, I dare say almost word for word, even though they are fiercely independent of each other. They all reached the conclusion Israel committed major humanitarian crimes and war crimes in the course of their siege of Jenin. Now, on that area as well, there wasn't always agreement. For example, on the question of Israel's resort to the torture of Palestinian detainees. The first reports on Israel's resort to torture first started coming out in the early 1970s. First of all, there weren't that many human rights organizations around back then. That's a new phenomenon. But even as the human rights organizations began to proliferate, many of them, and I don't think we should be afraid to say so, in particular Amnesty International, because it had large Jewish backing, financial Jewish backing, they were very fearful of touching those issues like Israeli torture. They put out one report in 1979 which says that there's some evidence of torture, and then they put out a famous, not torture, ill treatment. They use the word ill treatment. They put out a famous compendium in the 1980s. Amnesty International's main concern in the 80s was the issue of torture. That was their focus issue. And they put out a book on torture around the world. And again, in the case of Israel, the only phrase they would use was the phrase ill treatment, which is somewhat short of torture. Come the first Intifada beginning in 1988, now it's almost impossible to conceal what Israel is doing because the torture is being committed on such a massive scale. And there's a new Israeli human rights organization called B'Tselem, as I mentioned earlier, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, and they put out an important report in 1990 in which for the first time they assert unequivocally that Israel is engaging in the systematic and methodical torture of Palestinian detainees. Once the Israeli organization basically gave a cover of legitimacy, once they did, Amnesty International and then Human Rights Watch quickly followed, and they started to produce the reports as well. And now the record is very clear. You go through the reports from 1992, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99. Every single report in the Amnesty International Yearbook and the Human Rights Watch Yearbook, every report will say for every year that Israel is methodically and systematically torturing Palestinian detainees. Things changed a little in 1999 after a major Israeli high court decision technically banning torture. Things changed until the beginning of the Second Intifada, where once again Israel began to systematically torture Palestinian detainees. The most recent report is by the Public Committee Against Torture Israel. You can get it on your website. It's called PCAT, Public Committee Against Torture Israel. And the most recent report is entitled Back to the Routine of Torture. What's my point? My point is, once again, there wasn't a consensus for a long time. But now, just as with the history, but probably more so, in the case of the human rights issues, there's a broad consensus on what's actually happening. And that, to my mind, raises an interesting and, in some respects, fundamental question. If what I'm saying is true, there's a broad consensus on the history of what happened, and there's a broad consensus on the human rights issues, then what accounts for all of the controversy that swirls around the Israel-Palestine conflict? One would think that if there's a consensus in the historical literature and there's a consensus in the human rights literature, there ought not to be so much controversy, so much disagreement, so much conflict. And that's what I'd like to discuss this evening. I want to discuss what is the source of all of this controversy and disagreement and dissent on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And what I want to suggest is there are two kinds of disagreement and controversy surrounding this topic. One category, to my thinking, is legitimate disagreement and controversy. And the second category, to my thinking, is completely illegitimate disagreement and controversy. And I want to look at those two categories with you this evening. Let's start with the first category, the legitimate disagreement about the Israel-Palestine conflict. The first and most obvious point to make, though it's sometimes forgotten, is that two people or two groups of people can agree on the basic facts, but they can render altogether different moral and political judgments on the facts. You can agree on the facts, but not necessarily reach the same moral and political conclusions. For example, let's take the issue I referred to a few moments ago, the Palestinian refugee question. Many Israeli historians are now willing to concede, acknowledge, admit that the Palestinians were expelled in 1948. For example, the main historian who I mentioned a moment ago, Benny Morris, he calls it a partial ethnic cleansing. Not so important. The important point is, he says, I think it was a good thing. I think ethnic cleansing is a good thing. It was good, he said, when the Native Americans, referring to North America, were cleansed. It helped create a vibrant democracy, namely the United States he was talking about then. And he said he thinks a Jewish state is a good idea. A Jewish state could not have come into existence without an ethnic cleansing. And basically, it was a good thing, except he says Ben-Gurion, the prime minister at the time, he made a mistake. Namely, he didn't cleanse enough. From Mr. Morris's point of view, he should have expelled all the Palestinians from what became the state of Israel, and he should have expelled all the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza as well. So his main concern was that it was only a partial ethnic cleansing. It ought to have been a comprehensive one. If you take the case of Alan Dershowitz, who you heard a few moments ago on the screen, in his 1992 book entitled Chutzpah, it's an autobiographical account, though I don't think many of the facts have much to do with what actually happened in his life. That's a separate issue. In any case, in his book Chutzpah, he also talks about ethnic cleansing. And he says it's, quote, a fifth-rate human rights issue, he calls it, and he says it's analogous, it's comparable to massive urban renewal. The expulsion of a population from its homeland is not much unlike, he says, massive urban renewal. So, you can agree on the facts, but have very different moral judgments about the facts. Mr. Dershowitz's moral judgment, Mr. Morris's moral judgment, I would say are basically Nazi moral judgments, but they're moral judgments. And people can disagree at that level. Entering the moral universe of most normal human beings, from whom I exclude Mr. Morris and Mr. Dershowitz, entering the moral universe of most normal human beings, you can agree on the moral issues, but still disagree sharply on the political conclusions. So, for example, you can agree the Palestinians were expelled in 1948. That's the factual question. You can agree on the moral question that it was a colossal injustice that was inflicted on the Palestinians. That's a moral judgment. You can agree on it. You can even agree on the legal question, which is closely related to the moral one. You could say, given that they were expelled in 1948, they had an inalienable right to return to their homes. That's the legal right of return. That's a legal question. But then, and here people who are nodding and agree with me so far may now shake their heads violently, you can very sharply disagree on how to resolve that question 50 years later. You could say factually it was an expulsion. You could say morally it was a colossal injustice. You can say legally they have the right to return. But you could say politically it's either unreasonable, not pragmatic, or not possible to actually implement the right of return. That, for example, is the position that Professor Chomsky has articulated over many years. That's a political judgment. Others say, no, given the historical, moral, and legal facts, we want a full implementation of the right of return. Those are political disagreements, which to my thinking are legitimate. Even people who share the same moral universe and look at the world through the same lenses, morally and historically, they still can and they have a right to disagree on those issues, for example, the implementation of the right of return, with nobody being written off as the enemy. I don't accept that. We can disagree about that issue, and no one is the enemy. It's a different political judgment. And political judgments are just that. You weigh all the factors, the historical factor, the legal factor, the moral factor, and the factor of how do you resolve the conflict. Weighing everything, you decide that the right of return is not either practical or it's not prudent to try to implement it if you want to resolve the conflict. Okay, that's one category. The category, as I called it, for lack of a better term, of legitimate disagreement on the Israel-Palestine conflict. I have to emphasize one other point before I go on. Namely, among those who agree, among those who fit within the category of legitimate disagreement, the basic framework for resolving the conflict, the basic framework, has not been a subject of controversy at all. For the past 30 years, and more now, there has been a basic framework by the international community to try to resolve the conflict. The framework was first embodied in UN Resolution 242. It went through several refinements. By the mid-1970s, the entire world community, the main Arab states, the Palestine Liberation Organization, they had all basically come on board on the terms for resolving the conflict. And those terms were what came to be called, and still is called, the two-state settlement, namely a full Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza, the right of the Palestinians to an independent state in the West Bank and Gaza, and mutual recognition between Israel and Palestine, and between Israel and all its neighboring states. Now, that framework is almost universally accepted. Without going through the details now, I'll just give you a typical example. You look at the UN resolutions from, say, 1989. There is a resolution put forth basically outlining the two-state settlement. The vote is 151 to 3. The three dissenting votes are the United States, Israel, and the island state of Dominica. People used to ask, why Dominica? And I used to answer, because that's all that the dollar could buy back then. In any event, it's now many years later. The world's map has changed in fundamental ways. Both the borders have changed, political systems have changed. The Soviet Union has decomposed. The Soviet bloc is gone. Where it used to be in 1989 will surprise you. I think it certainly surprised me. In 1989, there were 154 countries represented in the United Nations. Now, the number is up to 191. In a brief span of 15 years, about 30 new countries have come into existence. What's remarkable for our purposes is, even though geographically and geopolitically, the map has changed, the consensus is still there. If you look at the UN vote for 2002, the vote on the two-state settlement is about 160 to 160 to 6. The 6 dissenting votes are, as always, the United States and Israel, and then there are 4 other dissenters. Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and Nauru. If you don't know what Tuvalu and Nauru is, don't feel embarrassed. Until I read the UN vote, I had never heard of them either. But that's it. So even though there is dissent and disagreement within the category I define, it's not dissent and disagreement of such a magnitude that there's all sorts of differences about how to resolve the conflict. It's pretty straightforward, it's pretty stable, it's pretty enduring. Okay, that's one side. Now let's turn to the other side, namely the illegitimate sources of disagreement and controversy regarding Israel-Palestine conflict. And I would name basically 3 illegitimate sources of disagreement and controversy. First, there's the attempt to mystify the Israel-Palestine conflict, to envelop it in all of this mystifying, cosmic terminology and invocation. So, for example, you often read, when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, that it's not susceptible, it's not open to normal, conventional analysis, because it's about biblical entities, ancient hatreds. Sometimes they say it's about cosmic conflicts over religion, clashes of civilization. These are all efforts, to my thinking, to mystify what's in fact a fairly straightforward conflict, not so complicated. Of course there are differences, as any conflict differs from the next, but basically it fits in within the category of conflicts, which is easily accessible, understandable, comprehensible to any rational, normal human being? Well, the roots of the conflict, not so complicated. The Palestinians fear, rightfully so, that if the Zionist enterprise were to succeed, it would be at their expense. And accordingly, from the beginning, from fairly early on, you could say from the late 19th century, and at a mass level beginning in the 1930s, the Palestinians resisted the Zionist enterprise from the fear, well, let's take Mr. Morris, that fellow at the right end of the political spectrum. At one point in his book, the one I held up, The Righteous Victims, he writes, the fear of territorial displacement and dispossession was to be the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. Allow me just to repeat that one more time. The fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was to be the chief motor of Arab resistance, Arab antagonism to Zionism. Well, when I came across that phrase in Morris's book, it almost leapt off the pages for me. Most of you listening to it will wonder, why did he cite it, and why did he repeat it twice? And why does he point to it with so much importance? The answer is, notice what Morris didn't say. Did he say the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism was anti-Semitism? Did he say it was hatred of Jews? Did he say it's hatred of Judeo-Christian civilization? Did he say it was a clash of religions? Did he say it goes back to the Bible? Did he say it was a clash of civilizations? Did he invoke any of these cosmic explanations for this conflict? No. Looking at the history, examining the record, it was perfectly understandable, perfectly comprehensible, perfectly straightforward why the Palestinians resisted. And the fact of the matter is, in any other conflict of a comparable nature, of an analogous nature, in any other conflict of a comparable or analogous nature, everyone would immediately understand what are the stakes and what are the roots of the conflict. Let's take an analogous case, the fate of North America's native population in the course of European encroachment. Well, as we know, the Native Americans resisted. And one could even say they resisted savagely. They were, if you read the literature, the Native Americans were yesterday's terrorists. Everything that's used, all the descriptive adjectives for the Palestinians, down to the last word, they were all used for the Native Americans in the 19th century to describe their resistance. And in fact, the resistance, if we don't want to be too politically correct, the resistance was brutal. It was savage. Not to say that the Euro-American encroachment wasn't brutal and savage. It was. Even Theodore Roosevelt, the famous American president, who wrote this classic 6-volume work called The Winning of the West, and he totally identified with the settlers who went out and conquered the wilderness and in the process exterminated native population. He said, he'll even admit, he said, sometimes in sheer savagery, the settlers descended to the level of those Indians. He'll acknowledge it. But they were savage Native Americans. However, in trying to understand the savagery, they attacked men, they attacked women, they attacked children, they were brutal. In order to understand that resistance, what would we say now if we opened up a history book and somebody were to write, a distinguished professor were to write, well, the Native Americans, they were driven by anti-Europeanism or anti-whiteism or anti-Christianism. Well, we would all do what everyone's doing now. You would laugh. You don't have to conjure up cosmic explanations for what happened. It's perfectly clear to anyone who looks at the record. They resisted because they knew, as the Palestinians knew less than a century later. People forget that there's a kind, it's not that what happened to the Native Americans is not ancient history. The process of the dispossession of the Native Americans in North America, in the United States, I don't know about Canada, it continues right through to the beginning of the early part of the 20th century. And many designers imagined themselves, when they were first coming over in the early part of the 20th century, that they were cowboys at war with the Indians. That analogy immediately leapt to mind. In any event, the point is that these efforts at dragging in explanations like clashes of civilization, religion, the Bible, and so forth, to my thinking, are simply efforts to confuse, divert, obfuscate what the real issue is. Not so complicated, rather straightforward. There's a second kind of illegitimate source of controversy and disagreement in my view, and that's what I call the playing of the Holocaust card, namely the dragging in of the Nazi Holocaust, again, to confuse, divert, and obfuscate what the conflict is really about. The Holocaust card is first played after the June 1967 war. It's often forgotten, and time won't allow me to go through the history, but it's often forgotten that up until June 1967, until the June 67 war, the Nazi Holocaust didn't figure at all in American Jewish life, let alone in the life of American culture generally. That may come as a surprise to many of you. Even, as I said, I had the fortune or misfortune over the past several months of reading through Professor Dershowitz's books, and you will find that he's very frank. He says, growing up and right through to June 67, neither he, and I want to point out, he grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home. Neither he nor any of his friends ever, that's his words, ever talked about the Nazi Holocaust. It wasn't the topic. And if you go through the memoirs, and I've gone through this whole history, I've written about it, it didn't figure at all in American Jewish life. To take one other example, the greatest living authority in the Nazi Holocaust is this fellow named Raoul Hilberg. And Hilberg wrote in the early 1960s what's still regarded as the classic treatment of the topic, the destruction of the European Jews. His was the old, well, let me amend that. In the 1960s, there were only, believe it or not, hard to believe, up until June 67, there were only two, hard to believe, only two scholarly studies of the Nazi Holocaust in the English language. Hilberg's The Destruction of the European Jews, and another book by a fellow named Gerald Reitlinger. And Hilberg, when he told his advisor, a very famous sociologist named Franz Neumann, he said, I'm going to write a book on the Nazi Holocaust. Neumann said, forget it. If you do it, you'll never get a job. He proceeded to do it, couldn't get it published anywhere. It was a dead issue. Why? Well, there's a long history why. The main reason being, with time not allowing me to go into it, the main reason being that beginning in the early 1950s, the United States entered into a major political alliance with West Germany. West Germany was our main ally, and most of the leadership of West Germany were just hangers-on from the Nazi regime. And you weren't allowed to bring up the Nazi Holocaust because that was seen as being communist propaganda, undermining the U.S.-West German alliance in the Cold War. An American jury, fearful of undermining their own place in American society, didn't talk about the Nazi Holocaust because they were afraid they would be accused of being pro-communist, undermining the U.S.-West German alliance in the Cold War, and so forth. So it was a dead issue. After June 1967, and this is a complicated history, not complicated, I don't think in my field nothing is complicated. Particle physics is complicated, my field is not. After June 67, the United States enters into an alliance with Israel. American Jews now discover Israel, which was also not part of American Jewish life before June 1967. Another fact that's been forgotten, they discover Israel, and when they discover Israel, they also discover the Nazi Holocaust. The Nazi Holocaust is not a discovery because of a sudden profound moral interest in the topic, not because of a sudden profound historical interest in the topic. They discovered it because it turned out to be a very useful, as it turns out, more so than I think they even imagined, a very useful ideological weapon to immunize Israel from any criticism. The main thrust of this Holocaust industry, as it sprung up after the June 1967 war, was to claim that nobody in the history of humanity had suffered the way Jews had, and therefore, given the unique suffering the Jews endured, therefore they're entitled to special moral dispensations, that they shouldn't be treated with the same moral categories and moral judgments as anyone else. And that proved to be a very formidable weapon. The other claim was that the Nazi Holocaust was the culmination of this irrational Gentile hatred of the Jews, that all anti-Semitism is irrational, and that the whole world wants to kill the Jews. And therefore, since the whole world wants to kill the Jews, therefore the Jews have the right, in the face of imminent death, to do whatever it takes to resist those efforts at their annihilation. And so between those two things, the suffering of the Jews is unique, and the whole world wants to kill the Jews, the basic theses of the Holocaust industry, it became a very successful weapon in clubbing. They wielded the weapon as a club to silence any dissension from what Israel was doing, first in the Arab world generally, and more recently in regard to the Palestinians. The Holocaust industry, or the Holocaust weapon, has in recent times, namely in the last couple of years, it's been slightly displaced by a new kind of weapon, and that's the weapon of what's called the new anti-Semitism, something about which I suspect all of you have heard. I understand there are conferences here already in the topic, and it's a daily topic in the news, the new anti-Semitism. Well, the first thing and most important point, I think, is the new anti-Semitism is not new. What do I mean by that? It requires a historical memory. You go back to 1974, right after the October 73 war between Israel and basically Egypt, but also Syria, what's sometimes called the Yom Kippur War. October 1973. After the war, there's a lot of pressure exerted on Israel to negotiate a settlement. You may recall that's when the Arabs used the oil weapon, and now there's pressure on Israel for a settlement. Go and look at what happens. 1974, the heads of the ADL, the ADL is the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League, it's a Jewish civil rights organization. It's called the Anti-Defamation League, and basically it specializes in defamation of character, defaming the character of anybody who is critical of Israel. In any case, the Anti-Defamation League in 1974, go to your libraries. It's an interesting question. They come out with a book. The heads are these two fellows named Arnold Forster and Benjamin Epstein. And you know what the book is called? Surprise, surprise. It's called The New Anti-Semitism. 1982, many of you may recall, it's the eve of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Israel is again under a large amount of pressure to negotiate a settlement with the Palestinians. The heads of the ADL, or the head of the ADL at the time, a fellow named Nathan Perlmutter, and his wife, Ruth Ann Perlmutter, they publish a book. What's it called? The Real Anti-Semitism About the New Anti-Semitism. Come 2002, you start seeing this proliferation of books, the first one of which is written by who? It's written by the current head of the ADL, Abraham Foxman. What's the title? Never Again. Subtitle, The Rise of the New Anti-Semitism. It's every 10 or 15 years they discover a new anti-Semitism, and the discovery always coincides exactly with a public relations crisis for Israel. What we have now is the new